The diner was buzzing with its usual lunchtime crowd, the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation filling the air. Behind the counter, a waitress moved with practiced ease, balancing trays and refilling coffee cups. Her uniform was crisp, her smile warm, but her eyes carried a quiet weariness. She had been on her feet since dawn, and the day was far from over. She was no stranger to hard work. Life had taught her early that nothing came easy. A single mother in her late 30s, she juggled 2 jobs to make ends meet. The diner was her second shift, after cleaning offices in the early hours of the morning. Her son, a bright-eyed boy of 10, was her reason for pushing through the exhaustion. She dreamed of giving him a better life, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort. The bell above the door jingled, and she glanced up, her smile automatic. But this time, her steps faltered. Standing in the doorway was a man whose face she recognized instantly, Clint Eastwood. The Hollywood legend, the man whose films had filled her childhood with stories of grit and determination. He looked older now, his hair silver, but his presence was just as commanding. For a moment, she froze, unsure if she was imagining things. But then he stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on her. She quickly composed herself, smoothing her apron and walking over to greet him. "Good afternoon, sir." "Table for one?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her chest. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Yes, thank you." She led him to a corner booth, the one with the best view of the street. He slid into the seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. She handed him a menu, her hands trembling slightly. "Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" she asked, her tone professional but warm. "Just water, please," he replied, his voice gravelly but kind. She nodded and hurried to the kitchen, her mind racing. What was Clint Eastwood doing in a small-town diner? She pushed the thought aside, focusing on her job. She filled a glass with ice and water, added a slice of lemon, and carried it back to his table. "Here you go, sir," she said, placing the glass in front of him. "Thank you," he said, looking up at her. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see right through her. She felt a sudden urge to say something, to tell him how much his movies had meant to her, but she held back. This wasn't the time or place. She returned to her duties, stealing glances at him as she moved between tables. He seemed lost in thought, occasionally jotting something down on a small notepad he carried. The diner's regulars didn't seem to recognize him, or if they did, they were too polite to stare. When it was time to take his order, she approached his table again, her notepad ready. "Have you decided, sir?" she asked. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'll have the special," he said. "And thank you for your kindness." The words caught her off guard. She blinked, unsure how to respond. "It's my pleasure," she finally said, scribbling down the order. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. But she had no way of knowing that the real moment, the one that would change her life, was still to come. When he finished his meal, she brought him the check, placing it on the table with a smile. "Thank you for dining with us," she said. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he replied. She turned to attend to another customer, unaware that he had left something behind. It wasn't until she returned to clear his table that she noticed the folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of his plate. Curious, she picked it up and unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words, and her breath caught in her throat. The note was short, but its message was powerful. "Your kindness and hard work don't go unnoticed. If you ever need a helping hand, call this number." Below the message was a phone number, written in neat, bold handwriting. She stared at the note, her hands trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't know what to think or feel. All she knew was that this moment, this simple, unexpected gesture, had touched her in a way she couldn't explain. Little did she know, it was just the beginning. The waitress tucked the note into her apron pocket, her mind racing as she continued her shift. The diner was still busy, and she couldn't afford to let her emotions distract her. But the words on that piece of paper lingered in her thoughts, like a faint whisper of hope she hadn't felt in years. As the hours dragged on, she found herself replaying the encounter in her mind. Clint Eastwood, a man she had admired from afar, had noticed her. Not just as a waitress, but as a person. It was a small thing, but to her, it felt monumental. When her shift finally ended, she stepped out into the cool evening air, the note still burning a hole in her pocket. She walked the few blocks to her small apartment, her feet aching, but her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Her son was waiting for her when she got home, his face lighting up as she walked through the door. "Mom," he exclaimed, running over to hug her. She knelt down to his level, wrapping her arms around him. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school today?" "It was good," he said, pulling back to look at her. "We learned about the solar system. Did you know Pluto isn't a planet anymore?" She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I did know that. You're getting so smart." He beamed at the praise, and for a moment, she forgot about the note, about her exhaustion, about everything except the joy of being with her son. But later that night, after he had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table, the note spread out in front of her. She traced the words with her finger, her mind wandering back to the struggles that had brought her to this point. Life hadn't always been this hard. She had once been a young woman with dreams of her own, dreams of going to college, of traveling, of making a difference in the world. But those dreams had been put on hold when she became a mother. Her son's father had left shortly after he was born, leaving her to raise him on her own. She had worked tirelessly to provide for him, taking on whatever jobs she could find. The diner had been a constant in her life, a place where she could count on a steady paycheck, even if it meant long hours and little rest. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Days when she wondered if she would ever catch a break, if she would ever be more than just a waitress struggling to get by. But then she would look at her son, at his bright eyes and infectious laugh, and she would remind herself why she kept going. The note on the table was a reminder, too, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world, that even in the midst of her struggles, there was hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. It was easy to cling to, but it could also lead to disappointment. She had learned that the hard way over the years. She thought about calling the number, about reaching out and seeing where it might lead. But fear held her back. What if it was a mistake? What if she was reading too much into a simple gesture? She folded the note and tucked it into her wallet, deciding to sleep on it. Tomorrow was another day, and she would face it the same way she faced every day, with determination and a quiet strength that had carried her this far. As she lay in bed that night, her thoughts drifted to her son. He was her reason for everything, her motivation to keep going no matter how hard things got. She wanted more for him, more than this small apartment, more than a mother who was always tired, more than a life of just getting by. The note was a glimmer of possibility, a chance to change their lives for the better. But it was also a risk, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to take it. For now, she would hold on to it, a small piece of hope tucked away in her wallet. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the start of something new. The next morning, the waitress woke up early, as she always did. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light through the thin curtains of her apartment. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the note from Clint Eastwood lying in front of her. She had slept fitfully, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Part of her wanted to call the number right away, to see where it might lead. But another part of her was hesitant, afraid of what might happen if she took that step. Her son padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, sweetheart," she replied, forcing a smile. "What do you want for breakfast?" He shrugged, climbing into a chair. "Pancakes?" She laughed softly. "Pancakes it is." As she cooked, she tried to push the note out of her mind, focusing instead on the simple joy of making breakfast for her son. But it was always there, lingering in the background, a quiet reminder of the choice she had to make. After dropping him off at school, she headed to the diner for her morning shift. The place was already busy, the usual crowd of regulars filling the booths and counter seats. She tied her apron around her waist and got to work, her movements automatic after years of practice. But as she moved between tables, her thoughts kept drifting back to the note. She found herself glancing at the corner booth where Clint Eastwood had sat the day before, half expecting to see him there again. He didn't come in that day, or the next. But his presence seemed to linger in the diner, a quiet reminder of the connection they had shared, however brief. It wasn't until a few days later that she finally worked up the courage to pull out the note again. She was sitting at the kitchen table after her son had gone to bed, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She unfolded the piece of paper, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the words again. Your kindness and hard work don't go unnoticed. If you ever need a helping hand, call this number. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. But before she could dial the number, she hesitated. What would she even say? How could she explain why she was calling, what she was hoping for? She didn't want to come across as desperate or greedy. She just wanted a chance to provide a better life for her son, a chance to chase the dreams she had put on hold so long ago. She put the phone down, her mind racing. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe she needed more time to think about it, to figure out what she really wanted. But as she sat there, staring at the note, she realized that time was something she didn't have. Life was passing her by, and if she didn't take this chance now, she might never get another one. With a determined breath, she picked up the phone and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear the sound of the ringing. And then, a voice on the other end. Hello? It was him. Clint Eastwood. His voice was unmistakable, deep and gravelly, just like in the movies. For a moment, she was too stunned to speak. Hello, he said again, his tone patient but curious. Hi, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. This is the waitress from the diner. You left me a note. There was a pause on the other end, and then he chuckled softly. I was wondering if you'd call. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. I wasn't sure if I should. But I wanted to thank you. For the note. It meant a lot to me. You're welcome, he said, his tone warm. I meant what I said. You've got a good heart, and it shows in the way you carry yourself. Not many people have that kind of strength. His words brought tears to her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. Thank you, she whispered. There was another pause, and then he spoke again. Listen, I'd like to help you. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with you and talk about how we can make that happen. She was speechless, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, he replied. Just think about it. If you're interested, let me know, and we'll set something up. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay. I'll think about it. Good, he said. Take your time. And remember, there's no pressure. This is about you, and what you want. They said their goodbyes, and she hung up the phone, her hands still shaking. She sat there for a long time, staring at the note, her mind racing with possibilities. This was it. This was her chance. But was she ready to take it? The waitress sat in silence for what felt like hours, the phone still clutched in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, hope, fear, disbelief, and a flicker of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Clint Eastwood had offered to help her. Not just with kind words, but with action. It was almost too much to process. She thought about her son, sleeping soundly in the next room. He deserved so much more than the life she had been able to give him so far. This could be the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to change their lives for the better. But it also felt like stepping into the unknown, and that terrified her. The next morning, she woke up early again, her mind still racing. She made breakfast for her son, trying to act normal, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call. She needed to talk to someone, to get advice or at least a second opinion. After dropping her son off at school, she headed to the diner, her steps slower than usual. She wasn't scheduled to work that day, but she knew her best friend would be there. They had known each other for years, and if anyone could help her make sense of this, it was her. When she walked into the diner, her friend was behind the counter, wiping down the coffee machine. She looked up and smiled. "Hey. What are you doing here? You're not on the schedule today." The waitress forced a smile. "I know. I needed to talk to you." Her friend's expression shifted to concern. "What's wrong? Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then pulled the note out of her pocket and handed it over. "Read this." Her friend took the note, her eyes scanning the words. When she looked up, her face was a mix of shock and disbelief. "Wait. Clint Eastwood wrote this? The Clint Eastwood?" The waitress nodded. "He came into the diner a few days ago. I served him, and he left this note. I called the number last night, and he offered to help me." Her friend's eyes widened. "Help you how?" "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "He said he wanted to meet with me and talk about it. But I don't know what to do. What if it's some kind of mistake? What if I'm reading too much into this?" Her friend shook her head. "This isn't a mistake. He wrote this note for a reason. He sees something in you, and he wants to help. You can't let fear hold you back." The waitress sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. But it's just, so much. I don't even know what I'd say to him." "You don't have to have all the answers right now," her friend said gently. "Just take it one step at a time. Meet with him, hear him out, and see where it goes. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain." Her words were comforting, but the waitress still felt a knot of anxiety in her chest. What if I mess it up? What if I say the wrong thing? Her friend reached out and squeezed her hand. "You won't. You're stronger than you think, and you've got a good heart. That's why he noticed you in the first place. Just be yourself, and everything will work out." The waitress took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Okay. I'll do it. I'll call him back and set up a meeting." Her friend smiled. "That's the spirit. And remember, I'm here for you, no matter what." Feeling a little more confident, the waitress pulled out her phone and dialed the number again. This time, when Clint Eastwood answered, her voice was steadier. "Hi, it's me again. The waitress from the diner. I'd like to meet with you, if the offer still stands." There was a pause on the other end, and then he chuckled softly. "I was hoping you'd call back. How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll send a car to pick you up." She blinked, surprised. "A car?" "Yes," he said. "I think it's best if we meet somewhere private. Don't worry, you'll be safe." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. Tomorrow afternoon." They finalized the details, and she hung up the phone, her heart racing. This was really happening. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She tried to focus on her son, on the simple routines of their life, but her mind kept drifting back to the meeting. What would he say? What would he offer? And most importantly, what would she do with the opportunity? That night, as she tucked her son into bed, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mom, are you okay? You seem different." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just thinking about some things. But don't worry, everything's going to be fine." He nodded, trusting her completely, and closed his eyes. She sat there for a long time, watching him sleep, her heart full of love and determination. No matter what happened tomorrow, she would do it for him. The next morning, the waitress woke up with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Today was the day. She had agreed to meet Clint Eastwood, and now there was no turning back. She tried to go about her usual routine, making breakfast for her son, packing his lunch, and walking him to school, but her mind was elsewhere. As she watched her son run off to join his friends on the playground, she felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't told him about the meeting, partly because she didn't want to get his hopes up, and partly because she wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you tell a 10-year-old that a Hollywood legend might change their lives? She walked back to her apartment, her steps slow and deliberate. The car was supposed to pick her up at noon, and she still had a few hours to prepare. But what did one wear to a meeting like this? She didn't own anything fancy, just her work uniforms and a few casual outfits. In the end, she settled on a simple blouse and a pair of slacks, the nicest clothes she owned. As she got ready, her mind raced with questions. What would he ask her? What would she say? She rehearsed different scenarios in her head, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. But no matter how much she prepared, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into the unknown. When the car arrived, it was sleek and black, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. The driver, a polite man in a suit, greeted her with a nod and opened the door for her. She climbed in, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her blouse. The drive was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound. She stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her small town give way to the open highway. They were heading toward the city, a place she rarely visited. The tall buildings and bustling streets felt foreign to her, a world away from the quiet life she had always known. Finally, the car pulled up to a nondescript building in a quieter part of the city. The driver opened the door for her and gestured toward the entrance. "He's waiting for you inside," he said. She nodded, taking a deep breath as she stepped out of the car. The building was modern and unassuming, with no signs or markings to indicate what it was. She walked up to the door, her heart pounding, and pushed it open. Inside, the space was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. Clint Eastwood was sitting in a chair by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as she entered and smiled. "There you are," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I'm glad you came." She forced a smile, her nerves still on edge. "Thank you for inviting me." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit down." She did as he asked, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you here." She nodded. "Yes, sir. I don't really know what to expect." He chuckled softly. "You don't have to call me sir. Clint is fine." She nodded again, feeling a little more at ease. "Okay. Clint." He leaned forward, his expression serious now. "I've been where you are. Not exactly, of course, but I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the world is against you. And I also know what it's like to have someone believe in you, to give you a chance when no one else would." She listened intently, her heart swelling with emotion. "When I saw you at the diner, I saw something in you, a strength, a resilience. You reminded me of myself, in a way. And I wanted to offer you the same kind of chance that someone once offered me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just listen. I want to help you, but I need to know what you want. What are your dreams? What would you do if you had the opportunity?" She hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent so many years just trying to survive that she had almost forgotten how to dream. But now, sitting here with him, she allowed herself to imagine a different life. I want to go back to school," she said finally. "I never finished college, and I've always regretted that. I want to give my son a better life, to show him that anything is possible if you work hard enough." Clint nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good start. What else?" She took a deep breath, her confidence growing. I want to help people. I've spent so much of my life feeling invisible, like no one cared. I don't want anyone else to feel that way. If I could, I'd find a way to give back, to make a difference. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that put her at ease. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. You've got a good heart, and that's something the world needs more of. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her. This is for you. She took it, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a check, the amount so large it took her breath away. This is just the beginning, he said. I'll help you get set up with a scholarship program, and we'll find a way for you to pursue your dreams. But the rest is up to you. She stared at the check, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me, he replied. Just promise me one thing, that you'll never give up on yourself, no matter how hard things get. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. I promise. The waitress left the meeting with Clint Eastwood feeling like she was walking on air. The check he had given her was safely tucked into her purse, but it wasn't just the money that had her heart racing. It was the promise of a new beginning, a chance to chase the dreams she had buried so long ago. As the car drove her back to her small town, she stared out the window, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She could go back to school, finish her degree, and build a better life for her son. She could finally breathe, finally stop worrying about how to make ends meet. But as the initial excitement began to fade, reality set in. This wasn't going to be easy. Going back to school as a single mother would mean long hours, sleepless nights, and sacrifices she wasn't sure she was ready to make. And then there was the fear, what if she failed? What if she couldn't handle it? When she got home, her son was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring in a notebook. He looked up as she walked in, his face lighting up. Mom. Where were you? She smiled, setting her purse down and kneeling beside him. I had a meeting, sweetheart. Something really exciting happened today. His eyes widened. What? She hesitated, trying to find the right words. Remember how I've always talked about going back to school? He nodded. Well, someone very kind is going to help me do that. It means I'll be busier for a while, but it's going to help us have a better life. He tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. Will I still see you? Her heart ached at the question. Of course you will. You're the most important thing in the world to me. This is for you, too. He smiled, seemingly satisfied with her answer, and went back to his coloring. She watched him for a moment, her heart full of love and determination. She would make this work, no matter what it took. Over the next few weeks, her life became a whirlwind of activity. She enrolled in a local community college, signing up for classes that would help her finish her degree. Clint Eastwood's team had set up a scholarship fund for her, covering not only her tuition but also her living expenses so she could focus on her studies. It wasn't easy. Balancing schoolwork with her job at the diner and taking care of her son was exhausting. There were nights when she stayed up late, studying by the light of a small lamp while her son slept in the next room. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But she kept going, fueled by the promise she had made to herself and to Clint. She wasn't just doing this for her son anymore, she was doing it for herself, too. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose, like she was more than just a waitress struggling to get by. Her son noticed the change in her. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, he looked up at her and said, "Mom, you seem happier." She smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "I am, sweetheart. I'm doing something I've always wanted to do, and it feels good." He nodded, his expression serious. "I'm proud of you." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she pulled him into a tight hug. "Thank you, baby. That means the world to me." As the weeks turned into months, she began to find her rhythm. She learned to manage her time better, to prioritize what was important and let go of what wasn't. She even started to enjoy her classes, finding a sense of fulfillment in learning and growing. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of self-doubt, times when she wondered if she was cut out for this. There were setbacks, like the time she failed a test and had to work twice as hard to bring her grade up. Through it all, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. She thought about her son, about the life she wanted to give him. She thought about Clint Eastwood's words, about the promise she had made to never give up on herself. And she kept going. Months turned into a year, and the waitress, now a full-time student, was making steady progress toward her degree. Her life had settled into a new rhythm, one that was still demanding but filled with purpose. She had even started to think about what she wanted to do after graduation, something she hadn't allowed herself to dream about in years. One afternoon, as she was leaving her sociology class, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Clint Eastwood's assistant, asking if she was available to meet with him the following week. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen or spoken to him since their first meeting, though his team had stayed in touch to ensure the scholarship fund was supporting her needs. She quickly replied that she was available, and the details were arranged. This time, the meeting would be at his ranch, a sprawling property just outside the city. The thought of seeing him again filled her with a mix of excitement and nervousness. What would he say? What would he think of her progress? The day of the meeting, she dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that felt professional but still reflected her personality. The drive to the ranch was peaceful, the rolling hills and open fields a stark contrast to the busy streets of the city. When she arrived, she was greeted by Clint himself, who stood on the porch of a rustic farmhouse, his hands in his pockets and a warm smile on his face. "Welcome," he said as she stepped out of the car. "It's good to see you again." "It's good to see you too," she replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you for inviting me." He led her inside, where a cozy sitting room awaited. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed photographs, many of them from his career in Hollywood. She couldn't help but glance at them as they sat down, her curiosity piqued. "You've come a long way since we last met," he said, breaking the silence. "How are things going?" She smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "They're going well. School is challenging, but I'm learning so much. And my son, he's thriving. He's so proud of me, and that means everything." Clint nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's good to hear. But I didn't just ask you here to catch up. There's something I want to tell you." She leaned forward, her curiosity growing. "What is it?" He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "When I first met you, I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. I've been fortunate in my life, but it wasn't always easy. I had my share of struggles, and there were people who helped me along the way. I wanted to do the same for you." She nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "And you have. I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me and my son." He waved a hand, brushing off her thanks. "That's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something important. The help I've given you, it's not just about money or opportunities. It's about believing in yourself. It's about knowing that you have the strength to overcome anything, no matter how hard it gets." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I'm starting to believe that," she said softly. "Good," he replied. "Because that's the real gift. The rest, the scholarship, the support, it's just a tool. The real work comes from within you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always thought of this journey as something external, something that was happening to her. But now she realized it was something she was creating, something she was choosing every day. "There's one more thing," Clint said, breaking the silence. "I've been working on a project, something that's very close to my heart. It's a foundation to help people like you, people who just need a chance to get back on their feet. I'd like you to be a part of it." She stared at him, stunned. "Me? But I'm just a student. What could I possibly do?" He smiled. "You've lived it. You know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the world is against you. And you know what it's like to fight back, to keep going no matter what. That's the kind of perspective we need. She felt a surge of emotion, her mind racing with possibilities. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, he replied. Just think about it. This is your journey, and it's up to you to decide where it goes. She nodded, her heart full. Thank you. For everything. He smiled, leaning back in his chair. You're welcome. But remember, this is just the beginning. The waitress left Clint Eastwood's ranch that day with a renewed sense of purpose. His words had struck a chord deep within her, reminding her that this journey wasn't just about getting a degree or improving her circumstances, it was about discovering who she was and what she was capable of. Over the next few months, she threw herself into her studies with even more determination. She also began working with Clint's foundation, sharing her story and helping to shape programs that would support others facing similar struggles. It was challenging work, but it gave her a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Her son noticed the change in her. One evening, as they sat together doing homework, he looked up at her and said, "Mom, you're like a superhero." She laughed, ruffling his hair. "A superhero? Why do you say that?" "Because you're always helping people," he replied. "And you never give up, no matter how hard things get." Her heart swelled with pride. "Well, you're my inspiration, you know. You're the reason I keep going." He smiled, his eyes shining with admiration. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she pulled him into a tight hug. "You're going to be even better, sweetheart. I know it." As the months passed, she began to see the impact of her work with the foundation. She met people from all walks of life, single parents, veterans, young adults trying to find their way, and each one had a story that resonated with her. She listened to them, encouraged them, and reminded them that they were not alone. One day, she received a letter from a woman who had been inspired by her story. The woman had been struggling to provide for her children, but after hearing about the foundation, she had enrolled in a training program and was now working toward a better future. The waitress read the letter over and over, tears streaming down her face. It was a reminder of why she was doing this, of the ripple effect of kindness and hope. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, when the weight of her responsibilities seemed too much to bear. On those days, she reminded herself of Clint's words, that the real work came from within her. She also leaned on the support of her friends and family. Her best friend from the diner was always there to lend an ear or offer a word of encouragement. And her son, with his boundless optimism and love, was her constant source of strength. As she approached the end of her degree program, she began to think about what came next. She had always dreamed of working in social services, of helping others the way she had been helped. But now, with her experience at the foundation, she realized she could do even more. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing her resume, her son walked in and sat down beside her. "What are you doing, Mom?" "I'm thinking about the future," she replied. "About what I want to do after I graduate." He nodded, his expression serious. "You're going to do something amazing." "I know it." She smiled, pulling him into a hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. I hope so." The next day, she received a call from Clint's assistant. They were expanding the foundation's programs and wanted her to take on a leadership role. It was an opportunity to make a real difference, to use her experiences to help others on a larger scale. She accepted the offer without hesitation. The waitress stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd. The room was filled with people, donors, volunteers, and individuals whose lives had been touched by the foundation. It was the annual gala, a celebration of the work they had accomplished over the past year, and she had been asked to give the keynote speech. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edges of her notes. This was it. This was the moment she had been working toward, the culmination of everything she had overcome and everything she had achieved. Good evening, she began, her voice steady, despite the butterflies in her stomach. My name is, and I'm honored to stand here tonight as not just a member of this foundation, but as someone whose life has been changed by its mission. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. A little over 2 years ago, I was working as a waitress in a small-town diner. I was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet and wondering if I would ever be more than just someone who served others. But then, something extraordinary happened. I met someone who saw something in me that I had forgotten was there, the strength to dream, the courage to keep going, and the belief that I could create a better life for myself and my son. She glanced at Clint Eastwood, who was sitting in the front row. He gave her a small nod, his expression filled with pride. That meeting changed everything. It gave me the opportunity to go back to school, to finish my degree, and to start a new chapter in my life. But more than that, it reminded me that I was capable of so much more than I had ever imagined. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had become like family to her. Since then, I've had the privilege of working with this foundation, of meeting incredible individuals who, like me, just needed a chance to believe in themselves again. And let me tell you, there is nothing more powerful than seeing someone realize their own potential. She shared stories of the people she had met, the single mother who had gone back to school, the veteran who had found a new purpose, the young adult who had turned their life around. Each story was a testament to the power of hope and the impact of kindness. This foundation isn't just about providing resources or opportunities, she continued. It's about reminding people that they matter, that their dreams are worth fighting for, and that they are never alone in their struggles. Her voice wavered slightly as she reached the end of her speech. I stand here tonight not just as a graduate, not just as a leader, but as someone who has been given the greatest gift of all, the chance to believe in myself and to help others do the same. And for that, I will be forever grateful. The room erupted into applause, the sound filling her ears and warming her heart. She stepped away from the podium, her legs trembling but her spirit soaring. As she made her way back to her seat, Clint stood and shook her hand. You did great, he said, his voice filled with pride. Thank you, she replied, her eyes shining with tears. For everything. He smiled. You earned this. Don't ever forget that. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and celebration. But as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had become her community, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had come so far, and yet she knew this was just the beginning. Later that night, as she tucked her son into bed, he looked up at her with a sleepy smile. You were amazing tonight, Mom. She kissed his forehead, her heart full. Thank you, sweetheart. You're my inspiration, you know that? He nodded, his eyes already closing. I love you, Mom. I love you too, she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his face. As she sat there, watching him sleep, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had faced her fears, embraced her dreams, and discovered a strength she never knew she had. And now, she was ready to help others do the same,